Are you concerned that young people today aren't going to be very economically viable?
It's a really good question because, like, to take a historical perspective, the issue I'm really interested in is this idea of social mobility, which is just a really sort of nerdy way of saying what is the link between background and opportunity in each generation. And when we look back historically over not just decades, but centuries, we see dramatic shifts in how economically mobile young people can be. So, like, to use a silly example, you cast your mind back, 500 years to Tudor England. The idea of someone from a kind of peasant background rising to the top of the food chain was seen as like not just kind of nigh on impossible, but almost sacrilegious. So you had a very clear demarcated social structure between aristocrats and peasants. And at this time, you didn't even really have any kind of proper urban middle class. And that class structure in many ways was literal, not just metaphorical, because it dictated not just your kind of political and economic rights, but often religious ones as well. And when you see some of these historical figures like, Thomas Wolsey, who, or Cromwell, who managed to get to the top of Tudor courts despite coming from normal backgrounds, they were derided for being peasants. So we've come a long way since Tudor England times. But even when you look in the 21st century in a sort of developed economy like the UK, 45p in every pound that you earn as a young person in the UK can essentially be predicted on average by the lifetime income of your parents. When you think about that, it's pretty dramatic, like in a sort of aggregated sense across the entire economy of young people. You can almost predict 1 out of 2 pounds that you earn. So we still see this very clear tethering between background and opportunity. And when we look back historically, there tends to be these massive jumps in social mobility whenever there's a big technological change. So from moving from the kind of medieval and Tudor period into Industrial Revolution, you see a big jump in social mobility, new urban middle class, lots of new jobs. Same after the Second World War, we have the sort of digital revolution, lots of new service economy jobs. We're about to enter a completely new technological revolution. And you'd think, looking back, that would usually be a good thing for social mobility. And we'll see young people today being ever more economically mobile. But I think the thing which is contingent and is still to play for is, is AI going to be like the digital revolution and industrial revolution? Or is AI going to be something that actually ossifies people's backgrounds because of how people can leverage finance and money to sort of get ahead in this new era? So that question of, for young people, how do you be economically mobile? How do you be viable? Is, I think, one of the most pertinent questions in 2025, even though you won't hear that being talked about on the TV or radio.
Well, I do think we hear it talked about sometimes, but not as much as we should. So with what you just described, I'm now thinking about every single time a major shift occurs, the pendulum swings, the cycle resets. At the end of the cycle, there's greater amounts of, not actually at the end of the cycle, but around the middle of the cycle, right? So if we say 150-year cycles-ish historically, around the middle of that time when the cycle gets to its peak, when the economy is doing its best, we tend to have improved social mobility, less of a wealth gap, and then things start to slowly decline until they start to decline even further. Then we're going to have things get worse before they get better, so the cycle can start anew and things get better again. But I think our responsibility as society, but society is a very big word. It sounds like it's outside of us and it's all of us to contribute, is to consciously ask ourselves, what's the kind of world we want to develop. We as human beings, we don't have to be reactive to what goes on. We can be proactive to create a different life, whether that's through policy or systems or whatever. What would your answer be? So to this question you have of we're not talking about whether in 10 years any person who was in their late teens or early 20s at the dawn of this shift was economically viable enough. Maybe we'll have mass unemployment of early 30-year-olds in 10 years from now, something like that. What is your framing about what we would need to do about that?
But when you look at all of the factors that drive social mobility, like the most obvious vehicle is education. And people kind of know this intuitively. Like the reason all developed and developing economies invest so much in public education is essentially to try and grease the wheels of social mobility. And when you look at the data in the UK, for example, you can explain around 50% of the earning gaps between high and low income people according to their education attainment. So I think that the key thing is going to be, how do we ensure that when it comes to building the skills of the future, the education system is fit for purpose? And that's something I think about a lot, because when you look at the British education system, for instance, hasn't really changed fundamentally in 100 years. Like, you went back to a classroom 100 years ago, sure, it would have a blackboard rather than interactive whiteboard, but the kind of fundamental pedagogies, technology is very similar. And I think that's a question that all Western economies are going to have to grapple with. How do we build an education system which is fit for the future? Because if we don't have the right education system to ensure that AI skills are democratized, we're going to see a massive gap opening when it comes to social mobility.
Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to the show, or back to the show for those of you who aren't new here. Getting lots of new faces these days, and so I just wanted to take a quick sec to introduce myself. Hey, I'm Seddon, and also to give you a quick announcement. As a little bit of background, this show used to be very focused on what it meant to be a leader, but I quickly realized I already had my answer, which is that I believe you already are one. And it's just about becoming more of that person you want to be. So we're talking about the world, self-leadership, personal development, humanity, discovery, self-discovery, and so much more. This is a place where deep conversations happen in a way that helps you become more of that person you want to be. And so if you appreciate that and you want to help us grow, that I know you're tired of people hearing. We've been hearing this for over a decade. Like and subscribe and share the episode, and I get it, but look, it is genuinely the biggest and best thing that you can do. I don't play ads or any crap like that. I do this and take this time to say thank you because I appreciate you and where this show is going. Thank you so much for being a part of it. Lots of love, and let's get on with the episode. You mentioned a couple of times this 45% stat. What does that actually mean, right? So are we talking about 45% of your wealth is because of the family you were born into? Is it that you'd make 45% more or less on average because of the family or location you were born into? What does that really practically mean?
So it's not fatalistic. So on the individual level, people have free will, or maybe we don't. But that's not saying that every single individual, 45% of what they earn is due to their parents. It's saying that when we look across the entire population of young people in the UK and perform statistical analysis, you essentially predict people's economic outcomes by looking at the earnings of their parents to around 45% accuracy. And the economists have a sort of very nerdy phrase for this. They call it the intergenerational elasticity of income. And even though nobody wants to use that phrase because it's awful and long-winded, the concept, I think, is so fundamental to every single facet of our political and social lives, because fundamentally, your ability to actually do better than your parents and break the link between background and opportunity, it is in many ways one of the kind of most primordial urges of every single human being. Like, no one wants to be constrained by the circumstances. And when you look at it across countries, you do see quite significant differences. So in Europe, for instance, the Scandi and Nordic countries, as per usual, perform really well on these indices. So in a country like Denmark, for instance, you can only predict around 20% of someone's earnings by looking at their parents. So you do see these really big differences. And in the US, for example, a country which in many ways philosophically is based on the idea of social mobility, like the American dream is just a sort of different narrative and a way to talk about that concept. The US actually does worse than the UK when it comes to social mobility. So even in countries which claim they believe in this concept, even in countries which kind of recite this in the classroom, we still see that the reality is very different from the belief. And when that reality-belief gap gets too wide, I think that's when you start to see social and political problems in societies. And that's what we're kind of seeing today.
Yes, that's exactly what happens. Is I learned a lot about this and these cycles from Ray Dalio. Do you know who Ray Dalio is? Yeah. So he talks about the changing world order. He wrote this book called The Changing World Order in 2021. And he outlines that they go through, in his words, 6 stages of a cycle. And stage 6 is when it totally collapses. And that we're probably in stage 5. Stage 5 is when the wealth gap gets worse, is when people feel more constrained, like their choices matter less, basically all the things you're describing. And then because people get fed up, things slowly start to, everyone gets angry. People don't know exactly what to say or to do about kind of what's going on. And then they start to riot. They have to pick people they want to be against or people to blame. This is why people being angry about immigration and people are very politically siloed. This is only going to get worse for this exact reason until social mobility improves. But it's interesting because when I was younger, I did a lot of work around social mobility. And I didn't think about this as a social mobility problem. I thought about this as a wealth gap problem, which are very interlinked. But what's your take on the difference between the two?
Yeah, well, again, to use the kind of economics-y, nerdy language, like income is a flow. So that income flows every year, you get salary. Maybe you're lucky enough to get dividends or inheritance. Whilst wealth is a stock, it's something that accumulates over time. So in that sense, income and wealth, they're not the same thing. They're different, but they're intricately connected because the more income you're able to accumulate, the more wealth you can build over time. One of the interesting things that we've seen in a lot of Western economies is that income inequality has stayed relatively constant for the past couple of decades. So we haven't seen big spikes in income inequality. Indeed, if you look back historically, most Western economies in 2025, from an income inequality point of view, they look much better than economies 100 years ago. Wealth is actually where a lot of the action is happening. So wealth inequality has actually got worse on most metrics over the past 20 years. And historically, we're getting back to a point now where wealth inequality is starting to look a little bit like it did before the Second World War. And I think the reason for that is in many economies, we've seen a kind of stagnation of income growth. Look at a country like the UK, median earnings have barely moved for over 2 decades, whilst the returns on capital actually have been pretty good the past couple of years. Now, you put your money in the S&P 500, consistently you're getting a sort of the 10% plus return every single year. And what that means from a social mobility perspective is the kind of head start you get from inheriting wealth or having rich parents is more powerful than ever before, because it's much easier to accumulate wealth through pre-existing inheritance than it is to build wealth through stagnating incomes. And that dynamic is toxic for economies because it makes inherited wealth more important than ever before and makes the kind of income that you can earn through your kind of merit and hard work less important. And for many people, less important to a degree where they think no matter what they do, no matter how much education they accumulate, no matter how good a job they get, how hard they work, they've got no chance of achieving real wealth because it's impossible to accumulate enough income to compete with someone who's inherited a lot of money.
What do you think the downstream effects of that are? Might sound like an obvious question, but let's project even further into the future. What do you think the downstream effects of specifically the part of your hard work, your merit, your effort, your talent, your intelligence not mattering so much anymore?
I think it undermines the very principles of capitalism. Capitalism, for most people, if you ask them about it, they'll begrudgingly say, no, it's not the best system. You have inequality and unfairness, but it's the best of a bad bunch. It's the best way we know to structure an economy. But capitalism is only inclusive if everybody, in theory, could be a high earner by applying their merit and hard work to get there. And when that equation breaks down, then you see people starting to turn against the capitalist system. Though you poll young people nowadays in terms of what they think about capitalism, liberal democracy, they're far more skeptical of these concepts than their parents and grandparents. And I think that is a really dangerous path to go down, because alienation with these core concepts essentially makes societies more unstable, because you've got lots of young people nowadays who look at the system and think, this is just completely broken, this isn't working for me. And the two kind of responses to that is either just you alienate yourself, you distance, you back out, you disengage, or you try and do something radical about it, to almost like have a roll the dice. Maybe I do something crazy and an off chance might make my life better, and that leads to political instability. So I think the perceptions of Gen Z and Gen Alpha about capitalism and liberal democracy and their decline are intricately tied to this dynamic where we've seen wealth become more important and income less important over time. Because a lot of people have nothing to lose. If you can't get a good job, if you can't buy a house, why would you vote for the same old kind of centre-left, centre-right political parties? Why would you stay invested in the capitalist system rather than engage in fraud or criminality? And I think one of the things I've seen go viral on Twitter recently is this whole concept of moonlighting in sort of Silicon Valley and London, where you've got remote workers working multiple jobs. And obviously for a lot of business bosses like me, we look at that and we're like, oh, that's disgraceful. That undermines the sanctity of contract and trust and all those other things. But I think the reason we see moonlighting is, for many people, they just think the conventional system of work is not enough to get on the kind of conveyor belt of social mobility. And that's where you do start to see these extreme behaviors. People who 30, 40 years ago never would have dreamt of doing something like that are drawn into kind of more and more extreme behaviors. You can also see it in things like gambling, for instance. The amount of gambling amongst young people is at historical highs. And yes, you can look at the internet, digitization. I think a big part as well is when people don't feel they can accumulate income through kind of predictable, deterministic ways, they do turn to more indeterministic stuff like let's go to the casino or let's bet on a kind of Slovenian under 21 football teams. Even though, or crypto. I think crypto is another case in point, right? If people feel like they don't have enough income to kind of accumulate wealth through the traditional stock market, they will turn to meme coins. So all of these things are symptoms of the same disease, which is that social mobility is broken in the West. It has been broken for 30 years, and we're about to enter a period of rapid technological change where it could either get better or worse. And I'm sat here today not quite knowing yet which way it's going. And I think that when you look at company earnings, for instance, and kind of the balance of capital and labor in the economy and sort of big companies, I don't think kind of bosses and shareholders have got kind of inherently more selfish, self-serving, even evil over the past 50 and 60 years. So I think we'll ask the question, if people are fundamentally the same in terms of their inherent constitution or their nature, what is driving these sort of changes in sort of where the returns to companies actually end up? And it's easy to sort of point your finger at kind of companies and say, oh, so regulation or bad behavior or whatever. But I think often government is the problem rather than the solution. And I think when you look at the returns of companies and whether that accumulates to shareholders or workers, I think the thing that's interesting is what's driving that. It's easy to sort of point at companies and say there's bad behavior or they're not regulated enough. But in many areas of the economy, I think government has actually been the problem rather than the solution. And governments doing things that sound well-intentioned has actually restrained social mobility. So to give you a classic example of that, the housing market, that is the number one asset that most young adults want to own, at least in the UK. Everyone wants to buy their own house. And when you look at how house prices have risen over time versus earnings, sort of around 60 years ago, there's around the sort of 3 to 4x ratio between the amount someone earned every year and the cost of buying a house. That has ballooned now in the UK to a ratio of around 12x. So houses have essentially become 3x more expensive relative to your income over a kind of generation. And what that means is that very few young people nowadays can buy a house based on the fruits of their labor. If you do buy a house, often it's because you've inherited money from your parents or grandparents. In many ways, it's quite depressing. Many young people have to wait until their grandparents pass away to actually have enough economic vitality to buy a house. So why have house prices increased so much? I don't think sort of builders or developers have become much greedier in 2025 than they were 30 or 40 years ago. It's often because governments have restricted planning. They've made it incredibly difficult. A house that would require 5 pages worth of planning application 100 years ago, today requires 1,500 pages. The governments have made the system incredibly complex. And things that sound great on paper in terms of checking the environmental sustainability of a building or like the noise pollution local area have accumulated to create a system that locks people from low opportunity backgrounds out of buying a house. So government is often the problem, not the solution. So I think an easy way to start would just be to look at the things government's doing really badly and just get them to stop. Not even any new stuff. Let's just look at what we did better 100 years ago and stop government doing the stuff that's getting in the way of economic mobility.
That's so interesting. I feel like with that specific example, a more viable answer is going to be get AI to do those 1,500 pages, which might be fine, right? Because some of those things are there for a reason. I do think it's useful to understand the impact on the local area, building a thing. But if it's all a manual process, then that 1,500 pages is going to take you 1,000 years to put together. And AI might be able to do it in 10 minutes or something. So
yeah, potentially there's a way we can get to the same output with less resources and less time. I think we also have to actually look at the outcomes, which is are buildings fundamentally structurally better than they were 100 years ago? Does the effects of a new build have a less worse effects in the environment than it did 100 years ago? Or mainly the questions that the differences are barely able to see. So we've sort of created so much burdensome regulation without actually driving the outcomes the regulations were there to create. So I think we need to almost go back to basics in the West, which is let's look at a lot of this kind of well-intentioned stuff that we put in place over the past 30, 40 years and actually work out, is this working or not? Because more often than not, sounds great on paper, the reality is very different.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You often cite this very British saying, the bank of mom and dad.
Yes.
Which is, as an American, has always been really funny, but also it's very self-explanatory. What does that mean for people who don't know what that means?
So the bank of mum and dad in a literal sense is the money that your parents give you throughout your lifetime to essentially make it easier for you to achieve economic and social opportunities. The most obvious examples of that are like the ones I just gave. Your parents sort of seeding your first deposit for a house, or maybe paying for private education. Those are the sort of big classic examples. But it's also the small things as well. And if you grow up in an affluent household, the bank of mum and dad is a kind of ever-present force throughout your childhood and adolescence, whether it's buying books, extracurriculars, summer camps, private tutors. The bank of mum and dad is a sort of constant stream of either literal or in-kind intergenerational transfers that essentially uneven the playing field when you're going through the most important stage of your life. And it's almost like such a factor of life that people don't think about it. And when we do talk about it and raise it as an issue, it's incredibly awkward to talk about because most people have some kind of experience, either positive or negative, with the bank of mum and dad. If you're from an affluent household, often you don't want to admit it was your parents who were kind of greasing the wheels of your journey. And if you're from a poorer household, that often you have a sort of degree of resentment because you had it harder than everyone else. So it's a really awkward topic to talk about, but I think it's really important we do, precisely because of that question of income versus wealth. Until we get on top of this issue and make it really, really clear that the wealth of your parents is a great dictator of your chances of success, no one's going to actually take that question seriously. So I think it's right we speak about the bank of mum and dad, but it's kind of gone underexplored for a long time there.
Yeah, well, we don't want to admit, we love to admit when we love to blame our problems on other things. We don't like to admit that our successes are because of other things. We're so quick to say, this external thing is the reason why I haven't done this thing, been successful. It was the market conditions, the investors didn't understand my business, whatever it is. But when it's our successes, we go, no, it's because of me. It's because of my talents, my intelligence, my hard work. And actually, it works both ways. Do you think that this is so bad that it's breaking the country?
I think human beings have an intrinsic desire to believe that they've got free will. Like we all, whatever we think philosophically, we all live our lives as if we've got free will and our kind of actions matter and we're somewhat in control of them. And like when it comes to the bank of mum and dad, people want to believe that their job, their education, their credentials or successes is due to merit rather than kind of the chance of what family you were born into. So like when you even speak to someone from an affluent background, often when they're narrating their personal story, they'll talk about adversity they've overcome, or if they can't point to adversity, they'll talk about their parents' or grandparents' adversity. My parents, they saved up loads of money to put me through private school. We did go on family holidays. People will tell these socially mobile stories because intrinsically we all want to believe in our free will. But the reality is, when you look at the data, it's not the case. That 45% stat we spoke about earlier. And until we actually dispel the myth that your own individual merits are the kind of sole determinant of your outcomes in life, we're not actually going to get on top of the factors that really drive outcomes, which more often than not all come back to the bank of mum and dad in people's childhood and adolescence.
And you think that impact is such that it's maybe not worsening, but changing academia, the world of work, your likelihood to raise money if you're building a startup, whatever, to the point where that's constraining the country's growth or development?
100%, because if you think about any thriving economy, the thing that drives a kind of developed economy is being able to optimally match talent and skills with jobs. So if you have a kind of educational career system which isn't fully realizing the talent of a big portion of people in the country, you've kind of got a really bad allocation of jobs and skills in that economy. You have all these people who might have been brilliant engineers or academics or startup founders who are just never able to realize those ambitions. And that's not just bad for them, that's bad for everyone because of the second order effects that come from people doing those things. Like when I think of my own journey as a startup founder, and it's not just good for me that I've been able to build a company, but I employ 30 people who provide services to big companies, 15,000 students have used our platform to get into university. There's all these second order effects which have sprung from me being able to realize part of my potential. But unfortunately for so many people, they're constrained. So we never see those second order effects play out in the economy. So it's difficult to kind of measure how big is that almost missing GDP that we're missing out of because of this. But based on some studies in the UK, for instance, if we could just get levels of social mobility similar to our Western European counterparts, closer to sort of your Germanys and your Netherlands, we could boost GDP by around £39 billion per year. So just a small increase, just make it slightly better, unlocks £39 billion of growth. That's enough roughly to give every household in the country a £1,000 check in the post. So this is not kind of a negligible small benefit. Getting this right is the thing that drives a dynamic economy.
This is really interesting. This is a really personal story or mission for you, isn't it? What is your story? What was life like growing up that led to you taking this frame that we've got to improve social mobility, especially for younger people, at this very critical juncture in history?
Yeah, so my story is I grew up in a small town in the north of the UK called Morley, which is a sort of post-industrial market town. And I grew up in a single parent family. My mum works in the National Health Service in the UK. I sort of made the journey through state-funded schools to Oxford University, which was a sort of crazy thing for someone like me to do. In the year that I graduated from Oxford, not a single person from the kind of parliamentary constituency in which I grew up got a place at that university. So I was a literal outlier, a data point that shouldn't really exist. But I was able to break through in many ways because the internet, for me, did to at least some degree democratise access to opportunity, in particular access to information. Someone like me never would have gone to Oxford 100 years ago. Like I would have been working down a mine in West Yorkshire. I was able to get into that university because the internet somewhat leveled the playing field, where I was able to research, how do you apply to these universities, the admissions process, level up my knowledge and skills. So it is possible in the 21st century to live a socially mobile journey like my own, but it's pretty damn hard. So there's so many of my friends grew up with who just at different points in their journey fell through the cracks of the system, which just isn't made for people from low opportunity areas. So when I graduated from university, I wanted to do something to tackle that problem. And that's where my company Zero Gravity was born, to essentially help the next generation of people like me access the top universities and careers that we know can change the trajectory of people's lives.
At that time, who were you looking up to? Who were your role models? Because many of us have those role models in the form of mom and dad, or of someone who is like us from our area, who went through whatever, ideally that we know. Sometimes the internet creates unhelpful role models or role models online, but that's not always the case. Who did you aspire to be, and who did you look up to?
I think my first role model was my mum, like not from a kind of professional network point of view, but from a kind of fundamental values point of view. And she developed a lot of the fundamental values that were the drivers of my journey. Growing up in a single parent background is tough, but the one thing that you do often get out of it is a hell of a lot of resilience, because resilience is this very kind of airy-fairy concept, but in many ways it's a muscle, and like the more you're able to go through adverse, tricky situations, especially growing up, the more you're actually able to build resilience. So growing up with a little bit of adversity in childhood, but a kind of one parent figure at least who was very resolute, did build the values that allowed me to push on. But from a wider professional network point of view, I didn't really have a kind of professional contacts because I lived in a small town where very few people who attended these top universities or elite careers. Like I didn't know a sort of investment banker or commercial lawyer or anyone who built a tech startup. Like these people that weren't from my area. And that's where the internet did make a little bit of a difference, because even if I couldn't connect with those people directly, at least I could watch what they were doing on YouTube. At least I could follow them on Twitter. So it wasn't a perfect solution. It wasn't necessarily completely transformative, but at least did a little bit to narrow that professional network gap. And with Zero Gravity, I essentially thought, how do we put that on steroids? Like, how do we actually give young people from poor towns a genuine professional network that's going to propel them forward?
And a lot of that work is looking at the academic system, working with academia. Academia has its flaws, though. There's the famous saying of the guy who invented standardized testing, saying that this is not fit for purpose, right? Which I'm sure you've heard before. So there's only so much that academia can show us. I mean, first of all, how are you looking at the whole picture of a human being, or at least more of the picture of the human being, the young person, and using that picture to understand more about them than we traditionally care to find out?
I think the category error that most universities, colleges and employers make is they apply the same philosophies they use to recruit 14, 50-year-olds to recruiting young people. So if you're a business who's trying to hire a new CEO, what you look for is absolute performance. And what has that person's track record been over the past 20 years? Because you want the finished product. You want the person who comes in on day one and makes a sizable difference to your business.
Yes.
But for young people, you're not investing in the kind of finished product. Yes. You're investing in potential.
I mean, literally their job is to develop that potential.
You don't want the finished product. Like, you are there to develop a potential. And then what is the biggest indicator of potential? Well, it's not really track record or absolute performance. It's contextual performance, because you want to understand what someone can become. You have to know what they've achieved today with the resources that they've had. And that is a sort of big shift in terms of how a university or an employer should recruit, because it moves away from looking at the standardized testing scores out of context to looking at, okay, someone may have a certain score, a certain set of grades. How good is that versus what you'd expect from someone from that background? And looking at things in that contextual form then gives you a far richer piece of information about someone than looking at it without context. If you've achieved 3 A's at A level in the UK in a school where most people are failing their A levels, that's far more impressive in my eyes than getting 3 A stars in a school where that's completely the norm, because you're surrounded by the students who are paying private school fees of 30 grand a year. So the move from absolute performance to contextual performance is the key thing to discover talent. And that's what Zero Gravity is specialized in. Finding these people who on paper might not necessarily look like worldies, but when you look at what they've achieved in context, like, wow, these people are performing 2 standard deviations above what you'd expect. So that person is a true outlier who, if you can fully cultivate their potential and talent, can do extraordinary things. But so many of them are currently constrained, and that's an issue.
You've also got to help train those people, right? And I know you folks help with some educational things for young people as well. Because of that, or through that lens, what are the things you think young people need to be learning the most? Like, what do we need to be teaching our young people? Talking about this, like, prepared to be viable, economically viable in the future, or maybe just even less cryptic or deep sounding than that, right? Making it very simple. What do employers need the most? What, even simpler than that, what do they find most useful? Do they want to learn how to code? Do they want to learn how to manage their finances? What aren't they getting in school? So what is that educational piece that those young people need the most?
Well, the most obvious kind of outputs you need for success is great grades and work experience. If you have those 2 things, it's much, much easier to get into top university or career. But what's the driver of those things? Like, what leads to great grades? What leads to getting work experience? Well, I think a big one is actually the concept of agency. Again, it's a bit of a sort of fancy, abstract word, but trying to turn people into people who can actually get stuff done and work out how to get stuff done. And that actually, I think, is a skill that you can learn and build over time. Like, if you're someone from a background where you're not exposed to new opportunities or new ways of doing things, you kind of assume that the way things are the way things have to be. Like, you've got no sense of your own agency and what you can achieve in life. However, if you deliberately expose new experiences where you're having to put yourself in positions where you feel a little bit out of your comfort zone, but then you're supported to actually overcome those challenges and make a difference, that's not just great in the moment. That builds that capacity for agency that starts to ricochet over your entire life. I feel this intimately as a startup founder now, where as a sort of 28-year-old founder, having done this for 7 years, any problem I face in life, I always just assume there is some kind of solution I can engineer to overcome it. And the reason I sort of think like that is because my day-to-day job is having to kind of build something from nothing, on starting from zero and having to defy the odds to create an outcome which looks crazy level impossible. So my mind's just been conditioned over time. But I didn't think like that when I was a 13 or 14-year-old. Like, whenever I was doing anything new, I thought, wow, this seems too crazy, intimidating. I could never be someone who does something like that. So that capacity for agency, trying to cultivate that in young people, for me, is the sort of most important kind of, whatever you want to call it, metacognition, soft skill you can give a young person, and that drives everything else.
Interpersonal skills, the self-development, self-leadership skills. And it's interesting because I look at the same thing, but for adults. I used to work with young people quite a lot. Now I mostly train adults. They might be early careers, or they might be entrepreneurs who are in their 30s and 40s, but all of them need the same thing. They don't know how to have these kind of conversations where we get really honest or personal. They don't know how to build the self-awareness, to self-analyze, to self-reflect. They're kind of go, go, go. And then the question for me becomes, how do you develop your potentiality when you have no idea where you currently are? So here's where I want to be. Okay, but where are you now? Are you far away from it? Are you actually pretty close? And then why? So if I'm really far away from that, and it's because I don't really work all that hard, and I don't believe in myself, and I don't have a strategy that makes sense, work on those core fundamental things. And then to my question really is, what are those core fundamental pieces of understanding? So you're describing this like high agency mindset. What works to help people with that? What have you folks been doing that you've seen really transform people's outcomes?
It's interesting looking at some of those other concepts like self-awareness, because I think a degree of self-awareness is important. Like, you want people to be reflective and have a clear sense of what those strengths and weaknesses are. But you don't want kind of self-awareness and reflection to kind of turn into like a constant therapeutic exercise. I think this is where this goes wrong for a lot of young people. I think as we've gone into a generation where it's increasingly become fashionable to kind of try and pick apart the underlying mental drivers of every single behavior, it can lead people to almost become overly conscious of what you do. And I think that can actually hold people back, because it leads people to have a deterministic mindset. No, I'm anxious in this room because of this thing that happened to me, or I've got imposter syndrome because of this. And I'm not saying that some of those analyses aren't true, but I think like overly kind of reflecting on that, there can be a constraint to actually putting yourselves in situations where you do feel uncomfortable, doesn't feel nice in the moment, but you are able to grow. So you need a degree of self-awareness for agency, but not too much. There's almost like a sort of happy medium, golden mean there. I think the other thing that you need to actually drive agency as well is you need almost a kind of hyper-pragmatic attitude to getting stuff done. And this is where the academic system fails really badly, because the entire academic system is based around the idea of perfectionism. Like, literally with standardized testing, isn't it? For the exam, you have a mark out of 100 and everyone's optimizing for 100%. But that kind of way of operating falls apart as soon as you go into the workplace. Like building a startup, there is no specification or score or thing to optimize against to get to 100%. Mm-hmm. It's constantly kind of building something, striving for an outcome, and then reorientating what you do. So I think to be agentic, you also have to have a degree of pragmatism about you. Being too perfectionist, too theoretical, again, leaping back to that self-awareness point, they can trap people in inertia. So with a lot of these things, I think it is about sort of creating the golden mean balance. And there was something the Greeks, I think, probably just inherently understood regarding what you need to create to build a sort of virtuous person. I think the same with agency as well. You need a solid balance of a lot of things, but not too much of any one thing, and that's difficult.
Yeah, you're a very practical person, which I really appreciate, because by working in the academic space, that's a very practical way in this country especially to work on this social mobility issue. The challenge is that this isn't just showing up in academia, right? Like you said, the academic system is, no matter how well you do it, helping those young people get through to institutions that might have overlooked them. The academic institutions, including universities, are also still going to have that issue, right? Yeah, academia, by its definition, an academic degree is a place that builds academics, right? So nowadays, like when I was in university, I was on our student council. We were looking at ways of getting more people, making courses more practical, right? More coursework, change the course so that we can do this. This is before, obviously, pre-COVID. Let's get things recorded so people don't have to come in. Lecturers, some would sometimes say, well, no, you have to go do the research yourself. And people would say, no, we want you to give us more ways of helping us, whatever. And I realized that we often complain about academia not being suitable for the world of work, but it was never meant to. Yeah. It was meant to create more academics. And so now we're trying to shoehorn practical results, because that's the path that came out, right? Which is why what you're saying is very practical, is very useful. But in our ideal world, what are these systems actually doing? Should we be funneling so many people through academia? Do we need new programs or new ways of getting those young people maybe directly into work placements or teaching them more practical things? We need to bring apprenticeships back, AI engineering apprenticeships. I don't know, but what do we need to be changing institutionally if we were ideally going to overcome the challenges you described?
I think you're right in your diagnosis of universities, because as universities have been sort of professionalized as institutions over the past century, they've essentially turned into institutions to provide education services to students and to some degree research services as well. Although that varies university to university. It's like you said, they're sort of pumping out essentially academics and teachers to teach increasingly large cohorts of students. That's not how universities used to be 200, 300 years ago. If you looked at a university 200, 300 years ago, you essentially have these almost like quite rogue, contrarian public intellectuals who wouldn't have a kind of specialism in one discipline. They'd veer across all sorts of stuff. Like when I was learning philosophy at university, you look at these people like, Descartes and Leibniz and Kant. Like these people didn't just, create new things in philosophy. They did things in mathematics, geography, the natural sciences. There's only actually quite a recent phenomenon that we've had academics who are hyper-specialized in one discipline. And I think that's come out of the fact that universities have turned into teaching institutions where it makes much more sense to almost build a Fordian supply chain where you have your geography department here and your politics department here and maths is over here. And you don't have these academic or researchers who are kind of straggling across the disciplines. So you're right, universities have changed over time and in many ways are not built to teach the skills of the future. The obvious thing that politicians turn to in the UK is they say, universities are broken, there's too many people going, apprenticeships are the answer. And everyone likes the fundamental concept of an apprenticeship because it's kind of that quasi-education, work experience. You learn a bit on the job, you do some theory stuff alongside it, which just kind of intuitively makes sense. The issue with apprenticeships is there's a kind of product problem here, which is for most businesses, actually running an apprenticeship program is a massive ball ache.
Yes.
Like if you're a business focused on your bottom line or how do we increase profits, get more customers, having to actually, cultivate talent full time, often talent that can't spend all its time actually doing productive activities that directly relate to outcomes, there is actually quite a sizable endeavor. So like what we found in the UK is it's been really difficult to scale apprenticeships. When you look at the number of 19-year-olds in the UK who actually start what we call a kind of higher level or degree level apprenticeships in the UK, the kind of high quality professional apprenticeships, there's only around sort of 6,000 to 7,000 people a year doing that. They compare that to the sort of 550,000 who go to university every year. You start to see the difference in scale. So universities aren't fit for purpose, but at least they have scale. Apprenticeships work intuitively, but there's a real problem with business adoption because for too many businesses, they're currently too hard to administer.
When we think about all the roles that a modern university fulfills, right? It's a place for them to live, it's the teaching and training, it's access to certain opportunities, it's lifestyle, it's access to each other. You're seeing this happen in the States where there's a few universities, quote unquote, that are like modern universities being built up. I wonder if we need something like that here, but it isn't a university. It's aiming to be really practical. It's not giving you a 3-year degree. It's giving you what modern university does, version of an apprenticeship, something in between the two that's still got the scalable, systematized thing. The only issue is, they make a lot of their money from the government or from institutions that are set up to support private payments. So it's a student loans, but it's my money because I got the loan, whatever, and that only works for your traditional university on top of all the bureaucracy that would be involved. So I don't know. I don't know if that kind of thing would help in theory, but it would be a ball ache to set up even if it did, right?
I think we have to first decide what our universities for. Like, are they for sort of developing the human capital of individuals and teaching them the kind of underlying skills that drive success in any career? Or is it about directly preparing people for the workplace? The answer to that question will change how you actually want to design that system. I think currently when you kind of look at what universities are for, I think Peter Thiel, the American investor, has got quite a nice framework for understanding universities, where he said, traditionally universities were about human capital. It's about, I do this 3 or 4 year degree, I accumulate all this knowledge and skills, and then that makes me a more productive worker. I reap the economic benefits of that. But for some of the top universities, like your Oxbridges, your Harvards, your Stanfords, that sort of still seems true today. And you look at people who go to these universities, they tend to go into top jobs and become highly productive people. But for many universities, that link between going to university, getting a good job, earning a lot of money has broken down. So if universities aren't about human capital, what are they about? Well, maybe another thing is maybe universities are almost like an insurance policy. Universities might not get you a great job, might not massively boost your lifetime earnings, but at least it'll mean you're not going to be unemployed, because you'll always kind of be seen as kind of hitting some kind of baseline. That means you'll be able to get some kind of job. Might not be the perfect job, might not be a super high earning job, but some kind of job. But when you look at that nowadays, we're starting to see in the UK this year, for the first time in a decade, big falls in the number of graduate jobs. The most recent data shows this year is probably going to be a 7 percentage point year-on-year fall in the number of jobs for graduates. So university doesn't even seem like a good insurance policy at this point, because there just isn't enough jobs to go around for everyone. So if university is not about human capital accumulation, and it's not about an insurance policy, what is it? Maybe it's just a consumption good. And you can actually see this in a lot of advertisements at universities. They'll talk about, this is how beautiful our library is, or this is a really cool accommodation you can get, and this is the student union. Universities, I think, have increasingly positioned themselves as consumption goods, where people go to university knowing, okay, I might not get a great job, I might not be able to get any job, but at least I'll have 3 really good years, meet some great friends, and maybe meet a romantic partner. And a lot of universities, especially the ones that aren't hyper-selective, are increasingly advertising and selling themselves on that basis. And that is a very depressing state of affairs. If you think about it, taking out hundreds of thousands of dollars of student debt for essentially something which is just consumption. Now, that is literally not an investment. So I think we have to look back at what should universities be for, because for many universities, they are now a consumption good. And it's only those sort of very selective elite universities that probably still hold the traditional role of accumulating the human capital that gets you into these top careers.
This is really interesting. You're very good at taking a look at an effect and going, okay, so what does this mean, the cause? What does this mean about the cause? What is the cause? What does this mean? You asked the question of, we need to decide what universities are or what they should be. What do you think they should be? Out of those 3 options or so you just described, right? Consumer goods, academic institutions, or practical institutions. What do you think the answer should be?
Well, I definitely don't think it should be about consumption, because in my mind, no one should be taking out debt to fund consumption. So for me, universities have to be about developing human capital. And that means either directly teaching people the skills that can get them into jobs, or developing the very fundamental skills that put you in a better position to get any job. And that's where I think universities could be doing far better. Like, there's currently a massive dislocation between universities and the labour market. But even for those universities that are trying to teach, the core skills that can get you into any job, that often the student experience just isn't up to scratch. When you look at the amount of face time people get nowadays with lecturers and the quality of content, as these institutions have scaled, they haven't been able to put in place the same quality assurance that they've traditionally had. So whichever one of those 2 things it is, industry-specific skills or the general skills that are good for everything, many universities are not doing a good job. And maybe let's start there and get that right before worrying about anything else.
Yeah, this is a very systems change conversation so far. For any young people listening, or any parents listening who have younger children, practically, they're going to be feeling a little bit lost right now, right? They're going to be searching for answers about how to navigate this radically, quickly changing world, and how to be relevant, how to stand out, how to deal with these challenges, because we all have to take care of number 1 first, right? What would your advice or practical solution be for them?
I would say be a disruptive insider rather than be a disrupted outsider. It's very easy to look at the world and say, this world, this system is broken, it's unfair, it's set up so someone like me is almost destined to fail. It's easy for many people to think that I could have thought that growing up. But the issue is if that is the belief that you ingest and then act upon, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, which actually makes the problem worse. And you get into that vicious cycle of kind of the alienation and despair. So I would say you have to accept that the system is broken, that it's messed up, but you have to play the system for what it is. But once you actually get into a position where you can do something about it, be the person that makes the difference. So be the person who gets the great grades at school, be the person who gets the work experience, gets the great corporate job. But when you're there, find a way to essentially put down the ladder for more people like you and change the system from the inside. There's far more progress society that's come out of disruptive insiders than disrupted outsiders. It's just that we like to herald disrupted outsiders because they're kind of inherently cool and contrarian. But for every kind of Malcolm X or Gandhi, you've got kind of 10,000 disruptive insiders who made a change who you might not even know about. So I'd say be a disruptive insider. It's more realistic, it's better for you individually, and it's the most obvious way you can actually make the world better for everyone else.
Practically, what does that look like? So let's say I'm a 17-year-old looking at what university I should go to. Practically, what does that mean? And then if I'm a parent of a 10-year-old, again, practically, what does that mean I should be looking at or doing?
Don't worry about changing the system. Play it for how it is. So if you're a 17-year-old and you have a dream to break into profession, go after it. I know that sounds incredibly crude, but for many young people, they think just because the system is so broken and hard, there's just no point in even trying. And that's the thing that we try and change at Zero Gravity. By sort of spotting these talented but low-income people early, we give them the tap on the shoulder. And that's not just about saying to that person, we can help you. It's actually about telling that person, no, we think you're special. It's almost like indulging people's kind of childhood fantasy that parents inculcate about, no, you're special, you're different from other children. Like, this is a story that all parents try and convey to their kids, that they're kind of inherently special and not just the same as everyone else. And the depressing thing about adolescence and adulthood is as you get older, you kind of increasingly realize that childhood fantasy isn't the case. And maybe you are just incredibly normal and mediocre. But that is the death knell of human ambition, to think that you're normal and mediocre. So be able to give people the tap on the shoulder when they're 16, 17 and say, we believe you're special. We believe you have it in you to defy the odds, to go further than other people have before. That lights a flame in people, which in many ways can start people on a journey they just never would have partaken before. So I would just say, just go after it in a crude way. Don't worry about changing a system. Worry about making your own life as most incredible as possible. And once you've done that, extend the ladder to other people.
Yes, then you're resourced enough to help others where you needed help, where you once needed the help. This has been really cool. It's a little bit different for me as well, because it's both systems change, economics, history. It's all the things that are really interesting that are outside of our control, but then it actually comes back to, well, what is in your control, right? And the classic response to that is, well, you can't control the ocean, but you can learn to ride the waves. And how are you riding the waves in your places and spaces is a good question. Joe, the show is called Lost in Searching, and I have a closing question that I ask everyone who comes to the show because of that. What is the number one question in your life that you are still searching for the answer to?
Gosh, that is a deep question to finish things off. I think one of the issues that's going to become really important is if we do move into a world where the AI is increasingly incorporated into the workflows of not just business systems, but political systems as well, I think there's going to be a massive question about fundamentally, like, what are humans good for? Like, what are those fundamental human traits or attributes that make us us? Historically, we thought about that in terms of cognition. The thing that separates us from apes is we've got these brilliant, beautiful brains that mean we have the capacity for language and rational thought and logical reasoning, but we've now finally created systems that are at least able to mimic our logical thought processes and get outcomes that beforehand only human beings could create. And I think that's going to open up the question is, if those things can be replaced, like what does make us us? And I think unless we answer that question in society, we are potentially going to get into a world where people feel lost. If you have your job displaced because of AI, that is going to undermine a fundamental sense of people's identity. So I think it's really important for us to answer the question, like what makes human beings so important in the AI era. Maybe not the sort of thing you're going to hear on the TV waves in 2025, but I bet you in 2030 it's going to be one of the big zeitgeist issues that everyone's going to be talking about.
Well, what's your answer so far?
I think, I know this isn't particularly intellectual, it's a little bit crude. I think there is just something about the kind of naturalness of interfacing with another human being in person. Like maybe it's just the kind of natural belonging you get to people of the same species, but there is just something really special about sitting down with another person over a beer and having a conversation, even if it's not the most kind of rational, logical, intellectually incredible conversation that you maybe could be having with advanced voice mode on ChatGPT. There is just something special about human connection. But what exactly that is, I can't quite precisely put my finger on. Maybe I'll leave the kind of psychologists to answer that question. But I think just trying to discern like what makes human connection so beautiful and so important is going to be a key thing for us to work out in an age in which AI can do a lot of the thinking and some of the doing as well.
Yeah, I mean, you say the logical psychologist, but it's also going to be the more spiritual leaning people too, right? It's going to be the people that believe we're more than our physical body, because intelligence might not be linear. Intelligence can also be intuition, arguably. We're going to have to figure out how we differentiate, which is so weird. We're figuring out how we compete with the technology we've created, like we're competing with another person. The answer can't just be to work harder, right? So,
and we've almost, like, I know it sounds a little bit dystopian, like we've invented a new species.
Yeah.
And like, most, like in the animal kingdom, like usually there is a hierarchy of species, and potentially we're entering a world where in the hierarchy of species, we're no longer going to be at the top and predominant. So either we're going to have to share, or potentially we're going to be turned into the pawns of these AI systems. I'd rather not think too deeply about the more dystopian futures, but in the kind of short to medium term, I think there will be questions around how do we leverage the unique skills of human beings that are not purely rational and cognitive.
I have a feeling, and I could just be hilariously naive, that long term we'll figure out a solution, but I do think you're right to say that like the short to medium term is going to be an existential issue. How long is that medium term going to be? I don't know. But anyway, look, dude, this has been really cool. I appreciate you for coming down today, for sharing not just your knowledge and experience, but also your belief systems, what you've noticed that most people don't get access to, and then the combination of them that helps us build a little bit better of a picture about not the problems that are out there, but the practical systems-based things that we will need to, do need to, and can navigate through. So that's been super helpful, man. I appreciate you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, pleasure.
Well, look at you making it to the end of the episode. Welcome. There's a lot more for you to do. If you're still here, there's a full playlist on YouTube down below. There's a recommended video probably somewhere around the screen or down below, and so much more. Give us a follow. Help share if you're here. Hey, maybe you enjoyed it. And look, this show only grows with your help. So again, I know you're probably bored of hearing it, but it would mean the world to me if you help us out and paid it forward and shared it around. And hey, you never know how this will help someone else. So thank you so much for being here, for being a part of it. Lots of love, and here is to your success. See you soon.